He encountered the delegates who looked through the human box instead of at it. 22 as of this morning. And GT, snorts. And GT. She kept the number in her head like a stone in a pocket. It was the kind of thing that kept her steady when everything else in the chamber felt like standing on water. The Concordat chamber was enormous. It was built to feel enormous on purpose. The ceiling was so high that sound got lost before it reached the top. The walls curved inward like the inside of a shell, and every delegation sat in tiered boxes arranged by age of the civilization, not the delegate. The older your species, the higher your seat. Humanity's box was at the bottom, between the Crethali, who smelled like old copper wire, and the moon sept, who moved so slowly it sometimes looked like they were frozen. Hines sat in the back of the human box, with her tablet open and her coffee going cold beside her. At the front of the box, Junho stood at the speaker's podium. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had stopped being young so long ago that it had moved past old and arrived somewhere else entirely. He spoke without raising his voice. He never raised his voice. Rooms went quiet when he talked because something in the air understood it was supposed to. He was presenting the fourth intelligence package for the second time. The first time had been 3 months ago. That session had ended without a vote. This was the make-up session. 72 slides, 3 years of censored data pulled from the outer rim. 4 ships that went out and only 3 that came back. Junho laid it all out the same way a doctor lays out an X-ray. Flat and factual. Here is the picture. Here is what it means. Here is what happens if you do nothing. The fourth cascade was a self-replicating weapon system left over from a war that ended before most of the species in this room had learned to write. It had been dormant for centuries. Now it wasn't. It was moving slowly, the way a glacier moves, slow enough that you could pretend it wasn't happening, fast enough that by the time you stopped pretending, it was too late. Heen watched the other delegates while Junho spoke. The Crethali on their left were doing something with their secondary fingers that her xenolinguistics training said meant polite waiting, but her gut said meant boredom. The moonsept hadn't moved in 4 minutes. Rael, the Concordat high speaker, sat at the central dais with his wide, pale face arranged into an expression of careful listening that was the political version of a closed door. Wujin leaned over from the seat beside her and slid a folded note onto her tablet. She opened it. It read there. Going to vote no. They voted no on Keltha Station is an asteroid field. Now, she folded the note into a small square and put it in her pocket. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. Junho finished presenting. The chamber opened for response period. 3 delegates spoke. None of them addressed the data. One of them raised a concern about whether human sensor arrays met Concordat calibration standards. Another used the phrase characteristically alarmist and let it sit in the air like he'd said something neutral. The third talked for 9 minutes about the review submission process and whether the package had been filed through the correct channels. Junho stood at the podium and listened to all of it. His face did not change. The vote was called, 28 against 3. In favor, humanity, the DAS observer block, and one small species that kept its eyes on its own table and said nothing either way. Rael read the official summary in the Formal concordat tongue. The translation came through Heen's earpiece in flat, clean syllables. The concordat thanks the human delegation for their continued contributions and invites them to resubmit through proper verification channels within the standard review period of. Jun-ho turned off his earpiece. He set it on the table in front of him. He set it down with both hands, carefully, the way you set something down when you have decided you are done with it. Then he stood up straight and looked at Rail for a moment, the way you look at a locked door you are not going to try again. Minjai was already on her feet. She was always ahead of the moment somehow, always half a step into what was coming. She was smiling. Minjai's smiles were a specific kind of thing. They were warm, in the way that a lit fuse is warm. Woo Jin closed his data tablet. He didn't save anything. Heen was the last one standing. She pushed back her chair and stood up and looked across the chamber at old Das in the observer gallery. Das was the oldest delegate in the room. By any measure, his species had been watching civilizations rise and fall. Since before humans had fire, he had seen everything. He claimed nothing surprised him anymore. His eyes were wide. Heen had never seen his eyes do that. She followed the others out. The corridor outside the chamber blast doors was long and white and smelled like recycled air and something faintly chemical that the station's ventilation had never fully cleared. Ven was already there. Ven was the Concordat security liaison. Shorter than most of his species, fast, with the kind of nervous energy that made him good at his job. He had beaten them out of the chamber somehow. He stood in the center of the corridor, with his hands raised just slightly, the way you'd stand in front of something you were trying not to spook. He asked them to come back, formally at first, then less formally, then with a tone in his voice that Heen had never heard from a Concordat officer before. Something thin and pressured, like sound from a pipe that had too much going through it. Jun-ho said 2 words, "We tried that." Then he kept walking. Minjai passed Vin without stopping. She smiled at him as she went by. Vin stood very still. Later he would write report about that smile. The report would be classified. Heen passed him last, and she could hear faintly through the blast doors behind her the sound of the chamber on the other side. It wasn't shouting. It was worse than shouting. It was 28 species, all trying to speak at the same time in 28 different languages, while simultaneously understanding for the first time that they had never bothered to write any rules for this. There was no subclause in the Concordat charter for a delegation walking out. Nobody had written one. Nobody had imagined they'd need to. She kept walking. The station civilian ring was bright and busy and completely ordinary. Aliens going about their afternoon, a Krathali merchant mid-transaction at a food stall, 2 Moonsep children pressing their faces against a window display, station workers in gray uniforms moving in clusters. Heen walked through all of it in her formal delegate blues and watched the news ripple across every comm feed and personal screen she passed. The story was moving fast. The images were already out. The human delegation box empty. The chamber in chaos. Rail's face. She stopped at the human coffee kiosk, one of 12 on the station, a negotiated concession from year 4. Nari was behind the counter. She had been running this kiosk for 6 years. She looked at Heen's face, and she said just one word. Already? Heen said yes. Nari filled her cup without being asked. Then she filled it again. Above the station, the human fleet had been running silent drills for 11 days. The drills had been getting longer. The ships had been getting closer together. Now, through the observation ring at the end of the civilian corridor, Heen could see them beginning to move, not back. Toward home, not away from the station. Perpendicular, turning to face a direction that had nothing to do with anywhere safe. Her earpiece chimed, Woojin's voice. Get to the ship, Junho wants us moving. In 6 hours. She finished the coffee. She put the cup down on the counter. She walked toward the docking ring. Without looking back. The human ship was called the Incheon. It was not the largest ship in the fleet, it was not the newest. The hull had patches on it that were a slightly different shade of gray from the rest of the hull, the way old scars sit on skin. You stop noticing them until someone points them out. Heen had served on it for 2 years and she had stopped noticing a long time ago. She was in the briefing room when Junho walked in. He sat at the head of the table without ceremony. Minjai took the seat on his left. Woojin was already there, 3 screens open in front of him, eating cold rice from a container with a fork because he couldn't find the chopsticks and had decided not to care. Heen sat across from Minjai and folded her hands on the table and waited. Junho talked for 12 minutes. He laid out the route, the timeline, the fleet formation, the engagement model, the supply situation, the communication blackout protocol. He talked the way he always talked, flat and direct, no extra words. When he was done, he looked around the table. Nobody asked if this was the right call. That window had been 3 years ago. It had closed somewhere between the first vote and the second, and the 4 ships that went out and the 3 that came back. Woojin said the probability window was 17 days before the cascade reached irreversible propagation. They had 18 days of supplies. Minjai said that was a comfortable margin. Woojin looked at her. Minjai was still smiling. Woojin went back to his screens. The fleet left Concordat space 6 hours later, 18 warships and 2 carrier-class vessels moving in a tight formation that the Concordat's long-range sensors would be watching and recording and not fully understanding. The course heading was filed as an exploration route. It was technically not a lie. They were going somewhere no one had wanted to go. On day 2, the first official communication arrived from Concordat Prime. Heen was assigned to receive all incoming messages, which meant she was assigned to read things and not reply to them. The first message was a formal protest of the delegation's departure. The second, arriving 4 hours later, was a formal inquiry into the fleet's current position. The third was an informal inquiry, which was the same as the formal inquiry, but with softer language and a warmer tone, like the difference between someone knocking on a door and someone pressing their ear against it. They kept coming, every day more messages, a request for the fleet's coordinates, a request for the delegation to return to station for continued dialogue, a message from Rail that was technically a ceasefire offer, but contained a sentence in the middle that said the Concordat could not assume responsibility for actions taken outside authorized parameters, which was his way of saying he still wasn't wrong and was only reaching out as a courtesy. Hien read that one twice. Then she put it in the same folder as the others. The message from Das was 2 words, be careful. She held that one for a while before she filed it. She marked everything received. She did not reply to any of it. She had learned from Jun Ho that not answering was sometimes the loudest response available. An alien government waiting for a reply that wasn't coming had too much time to think about why it wasn't coming. That thinking did more work than any argument she could have written. On day 4, the fleet crossed into the Vorath approach vector. The sensors started picking up the outer edge of the cascade 2 days earlier than the models had predicted. Wujin looked at the readings for a long time. He tilted his head slightly to one side. He said, Hien had learned that from Wujin meant something that would take a normal person a paragraph to express. She asked him what. He said the propagation rate was faster than the models assumed. She asked him how much faster. He said enough that the 17-day wind was now closer to 14. Minjai changed the fleet formation the same afternoon. She and Wujin argued about it for 2 hours. They argued the way people argue when they both know what needs to happen and neither of them likes it. The argument ended when Minjai drew a diagram on the tactical display and pointed to 3 specific ship positions and said these 3 take the pressure so the other 15 can do the thing. Wujin looked at the diagram for a while. He said that the 3 ships she'd marked were going to take serious damage. Minjai said she knew. He said the crew of those ships knew that too. Minjai said yes. The crews of those ships were briefed that evening. Hien was not in those briefings. She heard about them secondhand from a junior engineer named Balmy who came into the mess hall afterward and sat down across from her and stared at her food for a while without eating it. Hien pushed her own tray toward her. Balmy ate. They didn't talk about the briefing. On day 9, they hit the first cascade fragment. It was larger than anything the sensor models had projected. It was the size of a small moon, and it was alive in the way that a wildfire is. Alive, not thinking, not choosing, but moving with purpose that felt intentional even when you knew it wasn't. It absorbed energy. It replicated. It spread. Left alone, it would keep spreading until there was nothing left in its path to spread into. The fleet engaged. Minjai ran the tactical board from the bridge of the Incheon with the kind of focus that made the room around her quiet. People didn't talk when Minjai was in that mode. They watched their screens and did their jobs and trusted that the numbers she was working with were the right ones. Hien spent those hours in the communications bay. Her job during engagement was to monitor Concordat frequencies and log anything that came through. A lot came through. Concordat's long-range arrays had picked up the engagement. 17 new messages arrived in 4 hours. 3 of them were from Rail. 1 was from a species she had never heard from directly before, a civilization called the Veth Eyes, who didn't have a seat at the main council, but had 4 planets in the Cascades direct path, and who sent a message in basic trade tongue that said simply, "We are watching." She logged it. She didn't reply. Back at Concordat Prime, the chamber was holding emergency sessions every day. Now, Rail had moved to formally classify the human fleet action as unauthorized, unilateral military activity. The motion passed 23 to 5, which was progress for the 5, but not enough to matter. Dews had voted against it. He had also, according to a source Wujin, somehow had access to, stood up in the middle of one session and said something that made the room go quiet for a long time and then sat back down, and nobody had written the words into the official record. Nobody had asked him to repeat them. The station was tense in a different way than it had been before the walkout. Before, the tension was political. Arguments, procedural fights, competing motions. Now it was something older. The kind of tension that lives in the body, not the mind. Delegates arriving to sessions and checking their long-range screens before they sat down. Security staff running their own quiet calculations. The VETHI's representative, who had no formal seat, standing in the public gallery every session with their arms folded, watching. On day 12, the engine took the first major hit. The hull breach was on the lower port side, a section that contained 3 storage bays and 1 sleeping quarters. Everyone in that quarters block had been moved forward the day before on Minji's order. Storage bays were not recoverable. The A was patched within the hour using materials that the patch was not rated for, and the engineers who did the patching did not discuss what they were using because there were some problems you solved by not looking at them too long. Heen filed a damage report. She also wrote a separate internal log which she did not send anywhere. It was just a record. Day 12, hull breach, lower port. Crew reposition in advance, patch. Holding, everyone okay. She had been keeping the log since day 1. She didn't know why, she just felt that someone should write it down. Day 14, the cascade was bigger in the middle than the outside readings had suggested. Most things were Heen had found. You looked at a problem from far away and it seemed like one size. You got close and it expanded. The fleet was deep in the approach vector now, far enough that Concordat Prime was a 4-day travel behind them, and the stars looked slightly different from here. The same stars, just shifted enough to feel wrong. Wujin had not slept properly in 6 days. He was surviving on something he made in the ship's small kitchen that smelled like coffee but was probably not coffee, and on the particular kind of focus that some people find when everything else is stripped away and only the problem is left. He sat at the tactical display for hours at a time, arguing with his own models, crossing out projections and rewriting them, talking quietly to himself in the way of a man working a puzzle that kept changing its own pieces. Heen brought him food when she remembered. He ate it without looking at it. She had stopped trying to make conversation because she could see that conversation was taking up space in him that the numbers needed. Minji was everywhere. That was the only way to describe it. She was on the bridge. She was in the engineering bay. She was running drills in the corridors. At hours that had no names, she moved through the ship the way water moves, finding every gap, taking every shape. The crew watched her. They followed her not because they were ordered to, but because something in their bodies understood that she was the signal and they should stay close to it. On day 15, the fleet found the central node of the cascade. It was not what anyone expected. The outer fragments had been dense and fast. The central node was slow. It sat in open space like something sleeping, pulling at the surrounding energy fields. The way a drain pulls water. The sensor readings that came back from the scout probes made Woojin put down his coffee substitute and sit very still. For almost 2 minutes, then he pulled up the engagement model Minjai had drawn on Day 4 and started redrawing it. The 3 ships marked for heavy damage were the Suwon, the Dejian, and the Gwangju. Their captains had been briefed, their crews had been briefed. The Suwon's captain, a woman named Yuri, had sent Junho a message on Day 6. That was only 4 words long. We understand, tell us. That message sat in Junho's sent folder, replied to and done, but he, Anne, had seen it and she had thought about it for a long time. The engagement took 9 hours. Hien was not on the bridge for most of it. She was in the communications bay, which was 2 levels below and windowless and had a screen that showed her what the sensors were showing everyone else, but without the sound of the room around it. She watched the engagement the way you watch something through glass closed but separate. The Suwon moved into position first. She watched it do what it was supposed to do. She watched the cascade respond. She watched the reading spike on the Suwon's hull integrity gauge and then stabilize and then spike again. The other 14 ships did the thing. She watched the central node's readings change slowly and then less slowly and then in a way that the model said meant it was breaking apart rather than spreading. Woojin's voice came over the internal comms at some point during hour 7. He said 3 numbers. She did not know what the numbers meant, but the tone of his voice told her they were the right ones. The last node went dark at hour 9 and 14 minutes. She sat in the communications bay and looked at the dark reading on her screen. For a while, it had been putting out a constant signal since they'd first detected it. Now the signal was gone. The absence of it made the screen feel different, quieter. She hadn't expected silence to feel like anything. The damage reports started coming in. The Suwon had a breach across 2 full decks and was running on 40% power, and Yuri was sealing sections and redistributing crew and sounding in the voice messages completely calm. The DG and AMP-N had lost its main propulsion and was being pulled into tow formation. The Gwangju had taken heat damage across its forward section and one of its water tanks had ruptured, and the crew was dealing with the kind of flooding that happens when a warship suddenly has more water than hallways. The Incheon itself was venting atmosphere from the lower port breach that hadn't fully held. The engineers were back at it. Hien walked past the repair team at one point and heard them talking about what they were using to patch it. She kept walking. Junho filed the official engagement report himself. He sat at his desk in the command quarters with the door open and wrote it in plain text. No formatting, the way he wrote everything. When Hien passed by, she could see him at his desk, and she could see that the report was long. She had not seen Junho write anything long before. On day 20, the fleet began the slow turn back toward Concordat space. 3 ships under tow or limited power. Crew numbers down by 7, not dead. Injured transferred to ships with medical bays. The Incheon's hull patch was holding, but nobody was celebrating. That you don't celebrate things that are only technically working. Woojin slept for 14 hours. When he came back to the tactical bay, he looked at the now empty cascading coordinates on the display for a moment. Then he looked at Hien. He said, 4 billion roughly. She said she knew. He said, across 11 systems. She said she knew. He went Back to his screens. Nobody made a speech. There was no ceremony. They were in empty space days. From any station with broken ships and tired crews, and the thing they had stopped was gone, and there was nobody to tell. The Concordat sensor arrays would pick up the termination signal eventually. The math would arrive before the humans did, but right now in this moment, there was only the fleet in the dark and the sound of the Incheon's ventilation working harder than it should. Heen opened her internal log. She had been keeping it since day one. She wrote the date, she wrote what had happened in plain sentences. She wrote the name of every ship and what had happened to it. She wrote Yuri's forewords. She wrote the number Woojin had said, 4 billion, and the phrase across 11 systems. Then she sat for a while and thought about what else to write. She added one more line. Nobody was watching, so we did it anyway. She saved the file. She didn't know who would ever read it. She just felt that it should exist. Some things should exist even if nobody asks for them. Maybe especially then. The fleet traveled for 4 more days before the first Concordat communication arrived. That was not a protest or a demand or a request. It was from a species called the Vethis. It was from the same contact who had sent the message on day 9. We are watching. The new message said we saw. It said nothing else. He filed it. She put it in a separate folder from all the others. She labeled the folder something. She thought about the label for a while. Then she wrote the ones who paid attention. She closed her tablet and went to find food, and the engine kept moving. Its patched hull holding, its ventilation loud, its crew alive and quiet, and already without discussing it, thinking about what came next. The Concordat's long-range sensor arrays picked up the cascade termination signal. On day 20, the data came in over 6 hours, piece by piece, as different relay stations confirmed it and passed it forward. Technicians ran the numbers once, then they ran them again, then a third time. Because the third time is what you do when the answer keeps being something you didn't expect, and you need to be sure you aren't making an error somewhere. The answer did not change. The fourth cascade was gone. Rail called an emergency session. Within 2 hours of confirmation, the chamber filled faster than it had ever filled in. His tenure as High Speaker, not just primary delegates, every species had sent additional representatives, observers, analysts, aides, the public. Gallery was full for the first time in years. There was a station administrator. Noted in an internal memo she would later regret writing, a waiting list for Zeta. Rail opened the session with procedural language. This was automatic for him. The way breathing is automatic. When in doubt, fill the space with process. He spoke about the confirmation timeline, the sensor calibration, the reliability of the relay network. He did not yet say what the sensor data meant. Everyone in the room already knew what the sensor data meant, and they were all doing the same thing Rail was doing, which was waiting for someone else to say it. First, old Dew said it. He did not ask for the floor. He simply spoke from his observer seat in the flat, an unhurried way of a being who had been in enough rooms to know when waiting was finished. He said that the human fleet had destroyed the Vorath Cascade. He said it had taken them 19 days. He said the Cascade, if left alone, would have reached the galactic core shipping lanes in approximately 4 months. He said the species most directly in its path numbered 11, and that the broader economic and population effects would have touched conservatively everyone in the room. He said 18 ships. Then he sat back and did not speak. Again, the room sat with that for a while. Rail moved the session into formal deliberation. This was also automatic. The deliberation was not about whether the cascade was gone, it was gone. The numbers were the numbers, but about what it meant and what came next and how to discuss it without saying the things that needed to be said, but that nobody wanted to be the first to say out loud. 3 days later, Rail tabled a motion to formally classify the human fleet action as unauthorized unilateral military activity conducted outside Concordat jurisdiction and in violation of fleet coordination protocols. It was technically accurate. The motion went to committee. In committee it died in 2 hours, which was fast even by Concordat standards, because 11 species withdrew their co-sponsorship in the same 20-minute window. They did not coordinate. They each made individual calculations and arrived individually at the same conclusion, which was that attaching their name to a formal censure of the species that had just stopped something their own fleets hadn't been able to stop was not a political position they were interested in holding. Rail did not withdraw the motion. He let it die in committee without comment. His face during the public session that afternoon was the face of a man doing very careful arithmetic in his head, while appearing not to do arithmetic at all. Des watched him from the observer gallery. Des watched everyone from the observer gallery. He had been watching things from galleries for longer than most civilizations had been building them. On day 24, Vin opened a direct channel to the human fleet. It took 4 attempts before anyone on the human side accepted the connection. The person who answered was Heen. She had dark circles under her eyes and was wearing the kind of expression that lives on a face when the adrenaline is gone and what remains is just tiredness and the memory of what caused the tiredness. Vin opened with formal language because that was what he had. The Concordat wishes to formally acknowledge. Heen said, "We'll need medical supply convoys for the Inchin's crew, 14 specific compounds. List is attached. We'll also need a formal review of the intelligence submission process, and that review needs to be on the agenda before we agree to any statement of acknowledgement." Ven looked at his screen. He looked at the attached list. He said he would pass it along. Heen said, "Thank you." Then she said in a different tone, "The way you say something after the official part is done." "Hi, Vin." He said hi back. It was the most honest word either of them had said to each other since the walkout. The medical supply convoy was organized. Within 48 hours, it was the fastest the Concordat's logistics division had moved on anything in recent memory, which snorts several people noted and nobody discussed openly. At Concordat Prime, the shift was visible in ways that were hard to name. Delegates who had never initiated conversation with the human station staff were now doing so. The Krathali merchant in the civilian ring had expanded his stall and added 3 items sourced from human trade network. Small things, the kind of small things that are not small at all, but that nobody acknowledges because acknowledging them would require acknowledging why they happened. The Veth eyes, who still had no formal Concordat seat, had submitted an application for observer status. It had been in the backlog for 2 years. It was processed in a week. Species who had voted 28-3 against the Human Intelligence Report were now publicly and on record expressing support for a review of intelligence submission standards. None of them used the phrase "we were wrong." The language they used was more like, "The galaxy is complex and our processes must evolve," which meant the same thing, in the way that an apology dressed in a suit still means sorry. Rail made no public statement about the Cascade operation. He made no private statement either. His office issued a procedural memo about interfleet communication protocols. It was 9 pages. It said nothing. He and kept receiving communications. More of them now, different in tone. She read them all and filed them in the appropriate folders, and sometimes, when one was particularly careful and elaborate in how it said something, without saying it, she noted it in her internal log with a short sentence about what the words were actually doing. Her log was getting long. She had not meant for it to get long. It had started as a record and had become something else, a close and honest account of what the official record would not contain. She did not know what to do with it. She kept adding to it anyway. On day 40, Wu Jing came to find her in the communications bay. He sat down without being invited, which was normal for him. He said he had been running models on what would have happened if the Concordat had accepted the intelligence report 3 months ago. She asked what the models said. He said, roughly the same outcome, but with Concordat ships involved and probably faster and almost certainly with fewer hull breaches. She asked him why he was telling her this. He said he didn't know. He just felt like it should be said to someone. She wrote it in the log, roughly the same outcome, fewer hull breaches if they had listened. She looked at the sentence for a while. Then she saved the file and closed the tablet and went to find something to eat. Because the fleet was 3 days from Concordat Prime and there was still a lot of work to do before they got there. The fleet arrived at Concordat Prime on a Tuesday. No announcement. Junho had requested no ceremony and no honor guard, and the Concordat had agreed, which said something about how much had changed in 60 days. 6 weeks ago, the Concordat would not have agreed to anything Junho requested without 3 committee sessions and a formal review. Now they agreed because they had learned the way you learn things that cost you, that when Junho made a request, he was not negotiating. The docking was quiet, 16 ships, some under their own power and some still under limited capacity, moving into their berths one by one. The Su-1 came in last, towed into position, its hull dark in places it shouldn't be dark. Dock workers moved around it carefully. Nobody said anything about it. The people who had been on the Su-1 for 19 days walked off looking like people who had been somewhere real and come back from it, and the dock workers who watched them walk past did not say anything, but they stood a little differently after Heen walked through the civilian ring. For the 3rd time, same route. She did it without planning to, and then she was in the middle of it and realized she was doing it on purpose, that she needed to walk the same path she had walked when she left, because something in her needed to feel the difference. The Krethali merchant was at his stall. He was arranging something on the counter. When Heen walked by, he looked up. He made the movement with his secondary jaw plates that she knew. "Meant I see you," she nodded. He nodded back. It was a very small exchange, and she held it carefully all the way to the coffee kiosk, where Nari had her cup filled before she reached the counter. They didn't talk much. Nari asked if everyone was okay. Heen said more or less. Nari said that was usually the best you could expect. Heen said yes. She drank the coffee standing at the counter and watched the station go about its day around her. The delegation box had been moved. She noticed it when she walked into the chamber for the morning session. It was no longer up and separated, no longer tucked between the copper smell of the Krathali and the frozen stillness of the moon sept. It was on the floor now, level with the primary seats. The Concordats Facilities Division had issued a memo explaining this as a routine reconfiguration following updated spatial guidelines. The memo was 3 paragraphs. It was the most elaborate way she had ever seen anyone say nothing. She sat down in the new box and looked at the room from the new angle. It was not a dramatic difference. The chamber was the same chamber. The ceiling was still too high and the sound still got lost on the way up, but she could see faces she hadn't been able to see before. She could see Das clearly now, from where she sat in his observer gallery, watching her with those wide old eyes. She nodded at him. He nodded back. The session opened. Rail ran it with his usual precision, which she had always found impressive and now found slightly tragic. All that skill, all that ability to manage a room, and he had spent it for years managing people in the wrong direction. He called on delegates in order. He kept the proceedings moving. He did not look at the human box more than he looked at any other box, which she understood was itself a kind of statement. Delegates spoke. Species that had been quiet for years were not quiet today. The Veth-Eyes observer, formally admit to the gallery 2 weeks ago, sat in the front row and said nothing and had no need to, because everyone who spoke glanced toward that gallery at least once during their remarks. Their presence was its own argument. The proposals on the table were about intelligence protocols, about fleet coordination frameworks, about mutual defense consultation structures. Nobody said we should listen to humans more carefully. Nobody said we nearly lost 11 systems because we voted 28-3 against a report that turned out to be completely correct. The language in the proposals was structural and procedural and carefully neutral. It meant both of those things anyway. It meant them loudly. John Ho sat at the front of the human box and did not speak for 40 minutes. He did not fidget. He did not check his tablet. He sat in the same way he always sat, which was the way of a man who had nowhere to be but here and no hurry about being here. Other delegates watched him when they thought he wasn't noticing. He was always noticing. When he spoke for 3 minutes. He tabled 4 motions. Each one was specific, named a timeline, named a responsible body, named a process. No extra words. When he finished, Rail called the vote immediately. Maybe because there was nothing left to debate, maybe because he had learned what waiting produced. 31-0 every species. Rail's hand went up with everyone else's. Heen watched Rail's hand go up. She thought about writing it in her log. Later, she Snorts thought about what words she would use. She decided she would just write the number 31. That would be enough. After the session, the chamber emptied. The way chambers do, slowly in clusters, people finishing conversations or starting new ones, aides gathering, materials, the ambient sound of many species moving in the same direction. Heen stayed in her seat for a moment and let the room empty around her. Woojin sat beside her and pulled out his tablet and opened something and was immediately lost in it. Minji leaned in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching the last delegates file out with a particular expression she wore when she was satisfied but would not say so. Junho stood at the window. The chamber's main window looked out at the station's exterior ring and through it at the stars beyond. The same stars that looked slightly different from the deep approach vector and looked like themselves again from here. He stood there the way people stand when they are thinking about something they are not finished with. Old Das appeared in the doorway behind Minji. He moved slowly the way he always moved, and Minji stepped aside without being asked, which was unusual for Minji. He crossed the chamber until he was standing near Hyen, and then he stopped. He said, "You wrote the after-action report?" She said, "Yes." He said there was a line in it. He paused in the way someone pauses when they are choosing to be precise. "You wrote nobody was watching, so we did it anyway." She said, "Yes." He said, "That bothered people." Das said, "It is the only line in the document anyone here is still talking about." She thought about that. She looked at the old alien, at his wide and ancient eyes, at the way he held himself still, unhurried, like something that had learned patience by watching civilizations get it wrong. She wanted to ask him what it meant to them, that line, what it was that upset them about it, but she thought she already knew. You could deal with an angry species. Anger meant they still needed something from you. They were upset. They wanted something to change. A species that acted without an audience was something else. That meant they didn't need the audience. That meant they didn't need you to see. That was what the line said. That was what made it sit in people's heads. Das looked at her for longer, then he nodded once and turned and began his slow walk toward the exit. She watched him go. Then she opened her tablet. Woojin had sent her a flagged report while she was sitting there. She hadn't heard the notification. She opened it. New sensor readings from the outer rim, different sector from the cascade, different signature, something moving in a pattern that the passive arrays had flagged as irregular. She read the summary, then she read it again. She looked up. Junho was still at the window, but he was no longer looking at the stars. He was looking at her. He had his hands behind his back and his face was its usual unreadable, deliberate thing, but his eyes were asking a question. She held up the tablet. He looked at it. He looked at her. He nodded. She closed the report and stood up. Mingi pushed off from the door frame. Without being told, Woojin saved his work and put his tablet under his arm. Junho turned away from the window. They walked out of the chamber together. 4 humans in a row, back into the long white corridor, back toward the docking ring, back toward the ships. The galaxy was a very large place. It had a great number of problems in it. And it had apparently just learned something about who showed up for them.